A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was looking at some rental listings in London the other day, and it is staggering. If you are working a job that pays the official London living wage, which just hit £14 and 80 pence an hour this past May, you are looking at a gross monthly income of maybe £2,400. But then you look at a studio apartment in a decent borough, something like Hackney or even parts of Lewisham, and it is £2,000 a month. You are left with £400 for food, transport, heating, council tax, and everything else. It is a mathematical impossibility. You are essentially paying for the privilege of being poor in one of the wealthiest cities on earth.
That is the reality of it. It highlights the core of what Daniel's prompt is getting at today. He is asking us to look at the massive shift away from these static national wage benchmarks towards something much more granular. We are talking about instantaneous, artificial intelligence-driven, neighborhood-specific cost of living indices. I am Corn, by the way, for anyone new to the show, and this topic feels like the next major frontier in how we actually value labor in a digital economy. We've been using blunt instruments to perform surgery on our economy for far too long.
The timing is right because the old models are breaking. We have been relying on these broad, sweeping averages for decades, but those averages are becoming a dangerous fiction. When the national government says inflation is at a certain percentage, or the real living wage is £13 and 45 pence, they are blending together the costs of a high-rise in Manhattan with a farmhouse in rural Kansas, or a flat in Chelsea with a terrace house in Blackpool. It doesn't represent anyone's actual reality. It is an economic mirage that leaves people thirsty in the middle of a desert of rising costs.
That is what economists often call the resolution gap. We have the data now to see the world in high definition, but our policy tools are still stuck in low resolution. Think about the MIT Living Wage Calculator. It is a fantastic tool, and it was revolutionary when it first came out, but it usually operates at the county level. In a place like Los Angeles County, that covers 10 million people across 4,000 square miles, the cost of living in Santa Monica is not the cost of living in Lancaster, yet they are lumped into the same bucket. If you are a grocery clerk in Santa Monica, that county-level average is telling you that you can afford to live there, when in reality, you're probably commuting 2 hours each way just to survive.
And that is where the artificial intelligence piece comes in. We are not just talking about better spreadsheets or more frequent surveys. We are talking about systems that can ingest millions of data points as it happens to create a dynamic cost of living index at the 5-digit zip code level or even the neighborhood level. Imagine a wage floor that updates not every year but every month, based on the actual price of eggs and rent on your specific street.
The technical infrastructure for this is already being built, mostly by real estate and financial tech companies. Look at platforms like House Canary, or what some are calling Canary AI now. They are scraping rental listings, local grocery prices from delivery apps, utility rates, and even local transport costs every single day. They're not waiting for a government bureau to release a report once a quarter. They see the price of a gallon of milk or a one-bedroom apartment shifting by the hour. They are using large language models to parse the fine print in rental descriptions to see if utilities are included, or if a studio is actually just a converted closet.
So the idea is that we move from a static benchmark to a dynamic gradient. Before we get into the mechanics of how the AI does that, I want to look back at how we got here. Because the London living wage, which I mentioned at the top, was really the first major proof of concept for this kind of localized advocacy. It showed that the national floor was a ceiling for many, but a basement for others.
It launched back in 2001 by Citizens UK. At the time, it was a radical idea to say that the national minimum wage was insufficient for someone living in a global hub like London. They used a methodology that actually looked at a basket of goods and services needed for a basic but decent standard of living. It wasn't just about survival, it was about participation in society. It included things like the cost of a birthday present for a child or an occasional trip to the cinema. And it worked. Today, you have over 16,000 employers accredited under the Living Wage Foundation in the United Kingdom.
But even that has its limits now. Even a citywide wage for all of London is starting to feel too broad. The difference between living in Zone 1 and Zone 6 is massive. If you are a nurse or a teacher and you are required to be in the city, the current wage floors still don't reflect the geographic reality of your specific commute or your specific housing market. If you are working at a hospital in Westminster, but the only place you can afford is in Slough, the London living wage isn't actually helping you live in London. It is just subsidizing your commute.
Which brings us to the technical mechanism of how we solve this with modern data pipelines. If we want to move beyond those broad buckets, we need a system that can normalize data across very disparate markets. The challenge for an AI model here isn't just collecting the data, it is understanding the weight of different factors. In a rural area, transport costs might be your biggest burden because you have to own and maintain a vehicle, pay for insurance, and deal with fluctuating gas prices. In a dense urban center, transport is relatively cheap because of the subway or the bus, but your rent is 70% of your income.
I'm curious about the data integrity there. If we start tying wages to these localized indices, how do we prevent the AI from just reinforcing existing housing inequality? If the index says it is expensive to live in a certain zip code and employers are forced to pay more there, doesn't that just drive up the demand and the prices even further? It feels like a feedback loop where the AI identifies a fire and then pours gasoline on it to balance the heat.
That is a legitimate concern. If you have a neighborhood where the wage floor is $25 an hour because rent is high, landlords might see that as an invitation to raise the rent, another $200 a month, because they know the tenants have more indexed income. This is why the policy has to be coupled with supply-side transparency. But the flip side is that right now, we have a massive hidden tax on workers in high-cost areas. They are essentially subsidizing their employers by taking a lower real wage than their peers in cheaper areas. We are already in a distorted market. The AI just makes the distortion visible.
It is a geographic penalty. If you and I do the same job for the same company, but you live in San Francisco and I live in Des Moines, and we both get paid $100,000, you are significantly poorer than I am in terms of purchasing power. We touched on this back in episode 509 when we talked about remote pay wars, but the technology has advanced so much since then. Back then, companies were just using broad regional tiers like Tier 1 for New York and Tier 3 for the Midwest. Now, they can be much more surgical. They can look at the specific cost of living in your specific suburb.
And that brings us to a central challenge: geographic arbitrage. This is the part that really complicates the policy side. If an employer starts using these localized indices to set pay, what stops a worker from registering their address in a high-cost zip code while actually living in a van or moving to a low-cost region? We have already seen the digital nomad version of this, but neighborhood-level indexing makes the stakes much higher.
It is the digital nomad problem taken to the extreme. We have already seen people trying to game the system with virtual mailboxes or staying at a friend's place in the city while working from a beach in Bali. But I think the solution there is actually more data, not less. If the index is tied to where the work is actually being performed, or if there is a requirement for a certain number of in-person days, the arbitrage becomes much harder to pull off. You mentioned geographic arbitrage, and that is a huge point of tension.
But what about the purely remote worker? This is where the debate gets really heated in HR departments right now. Should pay be tied to the employee's location, the employer's headquarters, or some national average? If we use these indices, a company could theoretically say, we will pay you based on the cost of living in your specific neighborhood. But then the employee feels penalized for being frugal or choosing a cheaper area. And from the employer's perspective, they are paying for the cost of labor in a specific market. If you are no longer in that market, the value of that seat changes in their ledger.
I think we have to look at the social contract here. If the goal of a living wage is to ensure that any full-time worker can afford to live with dignity near their place of employment, then the index has to be tied to the labor market area, not just a single point on a map. You want a smooth wage gradient. You don't want a situation where moving 5 miles across a county line results in a 15% pay cut. It is basically tax evasion, but for wages.
The smooth gradient idea is vital. Imagine a map of the country not as a patchwork of states and counties with hard borders, but as a heat map of living costs. As you move toward a major city center, the wage floor rises gradually. AI can calculate those contours perfectly. It can look at commute times, the availability of public transit, and the density of affordable housing to create a fair wage floor that follows the worker. It is like a topographical map of economic reality.
We are seeing the early stages of this in the United States right now. By the end of 2026, we have had 88 different jurisdictions raise their local minimum wages. 60 of them are now at or above $15 an hour. But even then, they are still failing to capture what I call the neighborhood effect. You have cities like SeaTac in Washington where the minimum wage is significantly higher than the surrounding areas. You have situations where the minimum wage is $18 on one side of the street, but right across the street in the next township, it is the federal minimum of $7.25. That feels like a massive shift in how we think about the social contract. We have spent a century trying to build national standards to ensure a baseline of American life.
It is absurd that the federal minimum is still stuck at $7.25 when we have this kind of data. But the solution isn't just one high national number. A $25 minimum wage might be necessary in Manhattan, but it could absolutely crush a small business in rural Mississippi, where the cost of living is a fraction of New York's. I see it more as a return to reality. The national baseline has been a myth for a long time. The federal minimum wage has been stuck at $7.25 since 2009.
It is about market reality. If you are pro-market, you should want prices, including the price of labor, to reflect actual costs. When we use national averages, we are distorting the price signal of labor. We are making it look like labor is cheaper in cities than it actually is, because we aren't accounting for the massive cost of the infrastructure required to keep that worker alive and productive in that environment. We are essentially lying to ourselves about the cost of doing business in a metropolis.
I love that framing. It is about accurate price discovery. If an AI can tell a logistics company that the cost of living for their drivers in a specific part of Chicago has spiked by 8% due to local insurance hikes and rent increases, that company can adjust their rates and their wages accordingly before they lose their entire workforce to a competitor. It reduces the latency in the economy. Right now, it takes years for wages to catch up to inflation. AI could reduce that to weeks.
If I can't arbitrage my way into a better life by moving to a cheaper town, why would I bother moving? How do you actually enforce a hyperlocal wage floor without creating a nightmare for small businesses? A mom-and-pop shop shouldn't have to hire a data scientist or check an AI dashboard every morning just to see what they are legally required to pay their cashier.
It encourages companies to look outside of the traditional hubs. It prevents the brain drain from rural areas because people can stay in their hometowns and still earn a wage that is perfectly calibrated to their local economy. Those providers could integrate with a certified national data clearinghouse that provides the local index. The employer just puts in the employee's work location, and the system handles the compliance. It becomes invisible. The minimum wage just becomes a variable in the software, updated automatically based on the latest verified data.
Can you imagine trying to budget for a car loan when your hourly rate might drop next month because the price of eggs in your neighborhood went down? If a worker is told their wage is being adjusted based on an algorithm, they deserve to see the math. They need to know that the rental data being used is accurate and that it includes the types of housing they actually live in, not just luxury condos that skew the average.
But the index ensures that the floor is actually a floor, not a trapdoor. We need to build downward stickiness into the system so that wages can rise with local inflation, but don't necessarily plummet the moment a local grocery store has a sale. A localized index would be much harder to manipulate or ignore, because it would be based on the actual transactions happening in your neighborhood. If the grocery store down the street raises prices, the index reflects it. It brings the macroeconomy down to the micro level where people actually live.
I can see a world where this actually helps solve the housing crisis too. If employers are forced to pay more when local housing costs rise, they suddenly have a very strong incentive to lobby local governments for more housing construction. Right now, many companies don't care if a city is unaffordable because they can just hire people who are willing to commute 2 hours from a cheaper county. But if their payroll tax or their wage floor is tied to those local costs, they become an ally in the fight for more supply. They stop being passive observers of urban decay and start being active participants in urban planning.
It is a base plus kicker model. Instead of companies just fleeing to low tax, low cost states the moment things get expensive, they might actually stay and fight to make their current cities more affordable. It turns the wage floor into a feedback mechanism for the entire urban ecosystem. It forces a conversation about why a city is expensive. Is it because of a lack of transit? A lack of housing? High utility costs? The AI index highlights the specific pain points.
So, what does a concrete policy proposal look like? Are we talking about a federal mandate for hyperlocal indexing, or is this something that starts at the state level?
In this case, the weights given to different costs, housing versus healthcare versus transportation, need to be a matter of public debate. The AI does the heavy lifting of gathering the data, but the formula for fairness is still a human decision. For example, if you work in a zip code with an index of 1.2, your base wage is multiplied by 20%. It is simple, transparent, and reflects the local reality. You could even have transition zones, where the multiplier tapers off to avoid those benefits cliffs we talked about.
And for remote work, we could have a hybrid model. Maybe your pay is based 60% on the company's headquarters index and 40% on your home location. That allows for some geographic arbitrage, which gives workers freedom and allows them to build wealth. But it also acknowledges that the company is getting value from you being part of their specific corporate hub. It prevents the race to the bottom, where companies only hire people in the cheapest possible locations because they still have to pay a portion of the HQ rate.
I think that hybrid approach is the most realistic. It acknowledges that a job isn't just a series of tasks, it is a connection to a specific economic center. It prevents a situation where a company in London fires everyone and hires a team in a rural village just to save 60% on payroll. It keeps the labor market grounded while still allowing for the flexibility that remote work provides.
What about the risk of data bias? We know that AI models can inherit the biases of their training data. If we are scraping rental listings, and those listings reflect historical redlining or neighborhood divestment, could the localized index end up institutionalizing lower wages for minority neighborhoods? If the AI sees that rent is lower in a historically disadvantaged area, it might suggest a lower wage floor there, which then makes it harder for people in that neighborhood to build wealth or move. It essentially traps them in a low-wage, low-cost cycle.
That is a serious risk, and it is why the index shouldn't just be a mirror of current prices. It has to be based on a minimum income standard, the actual cost of a healthy basket of goods, not just whatever the current market is tolerating. We have to use the Joseph Rowntree Foundation's approach. What does it actually cost to live a dignified life here? That includes healthy food, reliable internet, and safe housing. If the market price for a room in a certain neighborhood is low because the housing is substandard, the AI shouldn't use that as the benchmark for a living wage. It should use the cost of standard housing.
It is the difference between a market clearing price and a living wage. The AI should be used to calculate the cost of a specific standard of living, not just to track how little people are currently surviving on. If we get that right, we could actually use this technology to lift people up by identifying areas where the cost of living is artificially high due to monopolies or lack of infrastructure.
I'm optimistic about it because the alternative is just more of the same. We are watching the middle class get hollowed out in our biggest cities because we are using 19th century economic tools to manage a 21st century workforce. We have the sensors, we have the processing power, and we have the connectivity. It is time our wage policy caught up. We can't keep pretending that $1 in Manhattan is the same as $1 in Memphis.
It really feels like we are at the end of the national labor market as we knew it. The idea that there is one single price for a certain type of labor across an entire country is dying. We are moving into a world of granular economic reality. And honestly, if that means a nurse in London can finally afford to live within 30 minutes of her hospital without having to skip meals, that is a massive win for society. It is about restoring the link between work and the ability to live.
It is a win for everyone. It makes the economy more resilient. When people aren't stretched to the absolute breaking point just to keep a roof over their heads, they have more mental bandwidth to be productive, to innovate, and to participate in their communities. It is about human capital. If we treat labor as a commodity with a single national price, we ignore the human element of where that labor actually exists.
I think the takeaway for the people listening, especially those in HR or policy roles, is to start looking at these tools now. Don't wait for a government mandate. You can start building more equitable, data-driven pay structures using the indices that are already available. Transparency is your best friend here. If you can show your employees exactly why they are being paid what they are, based on the actual costs they are facing in their specific zip code, you build a much higher level of trust. You move away from what can we get away with paying to what is the fair cost of this labor in this location.
And for the developers and data scientists out there, the challenge is building these indices in a way that is robust, ethical, and transparent. We need open source models for cost of living calculations. We need to be able to audit the scrapers and the weighting algorithms. This is one of the most important applications of AI we could work on, because it directly impacts the survival and flourishing of millions of people. We need to make sure the canary in the coal mine isn't just a proprietary algorithm owned by a hedge fund.
It is a big lift, but it is necessary. If we don't do it, we are just going to keep seeing these massive protests and strikes every time inflation ticks up, because the official numbers don't reflect the pain people are feeling at the checkout counter and the leasing office. The inflation gap we talked about in episode 1014 is only going to widen if we don't get more granular.
This has been a great deep dive. I think it is one of those topics that sounds technical, all about indices and data pipelines, but it is actually deeply personal for almost everyone working today. Whether you are a remote developer or a retail worker, your geographic reality is your economic reality. We are finally getting the tools to acknowledge that.
I think that is a good place to wrap this one up. It is a complex issue, but the potential for AI to bring some much-needed fairness to the system is really exciting. We will definitely be keeping an eye on how these local jurisdictions continue to experiment with their own wage floors through the rest of 2026 and beyond. The neighborhood effect is only going to become more pronounced as the data gets better.
I agree. We should probably mention that if you want to dig deeper into the inflation side of this, check out episode 1014, where we talked about why the consumer price index feels so disconnected from our daily lives. It provides a lot of the foundational context for why we need these localized tools in the first place.
Good call. And if you are interested in the remote work angle, episode 529 on geographic arbitrage is still very relevant, even if the tech has moved fast since we recorded it. It covers the early days of companies trying to figure out how to pay people who moved to the mountains during the pandemic.
Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes and making sure we don't wander too far off into the weeds. And a huge thank you to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the research and generation of this show. They make this kind of deep dive analysis possible by letting us run the models that find these patterns in the first place.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are finding these discussions valuable, we would really appreciate it if you could leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It truly helps more people find the show and join the conversation about how technology is reshaping our world.
You can also find us on Telegram if you want to get notified the second a new episode drops, or if you want to suggest a prompt for a future episode. Just search for My Weird Prompts there.
We will see you in the next one.
Take care.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow to